Good afternoon, historians. Chris Wood again. I hope this semester has found you well. I'm standing on the front lawn of the world's largest Confederate monument, the carving on the face of Stone Mountain, located about 15 miles east of Atlanta. This carving depicts the likenesses of the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and Generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Much has been made in recent years about the morality of preserving such statues. More than 160 Confederate monuments and memorials have been removed by federal, state, and local governments, and in some cases, by protesters. In the same vein, schools and military bases around the country named after Confederate heroes and leaders have been renamed to something less offensive. The debate recently, in the past decade or so, has been over statues, monuments, and memorials. But the morality debate has not always centered around how the war was memorialized. The morality of the war has been debated by historians, politicians, and laypersons alike since its conclusion. Prior to our current debates on historical memory, but still rather recent, it was the morality of the war itself that was questioned by scholars. Harry S. Stout, in his Upon the Altar of the Nation, attempts to argue that the war and the aims of the war, that is, emancipation, were not justified given the great number of casualties. Dr. Stephen Woodworth, in our lecture video this week, rightly questioned Stout's central conclusion by asking, how many casualties would it have been worth to save the United States or to free the slaves? He goes on to stress the same point in other wars as well. And the question now that should be raised is any war moral if we base it merely on the number of casualties? According to Stout's own line of reasoning, his answer would likely be no. This begs another set of questions that I would like to ask Stout. How does one quantify war aims in terms of casualties to assess morality? What methodology, Professor Stout, did you use to do this? What is the value of emancipation in terms of casualties? Are there any casualties that would be valued higher than that of emancipation? When these questions are posed, it is apparent that his judgments are rendered invalid. Another very recent historian who questioned the morality of the Civil War was David R. Goldfield in America Aflame, published in 2011. In it, he uses the specific example of the Civil War to depict the gruesome nature of war in general. He does this to provide a stark contrast to what he purports to be the answer to the emancipation conundrum, which is a peaceful economic solution. Purchase the freedom of the slaves from the slaveholders. Why not? The proposed cost would serve more prudently than that of waging a war between two halves of the same nation. Clearly, this should have been proposed. Turns out that it was. Lincoln's attempt at compensated emancipation failed to take into account that slavery was about more than just the transactional value of a slave. The Guild of Slaveholders looked at the institution of slavery as a whole and the impact that its dismantling would have on their largely agrarian economy. There were not just economic arguments in favor of slavery. The more religious of slaveholders viewed slavery as God's will. In Apostles of Disunion, Charles B. Dew quotes Judge Alexander Hamilton Handy. Slavery was ordained by God and sanctioned by man. Throughout America Aflame, Goldfield shows his scathing appraisal of religion and Protestant Christianity in particular, whether it be his snarky criticism of Walt Whitman, Henry Ward Beecher, or his overarching criticism of Christianity's role in perpetuating the war. Professor Goldfield, to say the least, was not a fan. If you listen to a man long enough, he will tell you what he believes. Professor Woodworth, on the other hand, in his book While God is Marching On, looked at the Civil War through the words of the individual soldier, specifically regarding their faith and their views of morality of such things as fighting and slavery. This approach to viewing Civil War topics through the words of those who were at the center of it is much akin to James McPherson in For Cause and Comrades, where he looked at the causes and motivations of soldiers, while Jonathan Steplick, in Fighting Means Killing, looked at how soldiers viewed killing, death, and dying. I think Woodworth, McPherson, and Steplick bring up a fair point here in their approach to writing that indirectly provides a rebuttal to Stout and Goldfield and their approach to Civil War analysis. The Civil War is very complex and a complicated event comprised of a myriad of intertwined narratives, causes, mixed with heroes and villains on both sides of the conflict, can be viewed through the dictates of the individual, be it soldier, general, civilian, secessionist, commissioner, politicians, or heads of state, and not the collective oversimplification of correlative speculation. In closing, I will refer to my introductory discussion of the erasure of historical memory. We must take the same approach to evaluating monument removal as we do to the morality of the Civil War, on an individual basis. A statue of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, or a carving including both, is not a symbol of racism and hate, but a piece of historical memory honoring the individual. They also serve as a reminder of our national history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. A history forgotten is a history that is doomed to be repeated. Thanks, and Godspeed.